Good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome to you all on behalf of the University of the West Indies, Sridhar Franfal Center, and co-hosted with the UWK Phil's Faculty of Law, Law and Health Research Unit. Welcome to our lunchtime chat, looking at the very important topic of trade and the Bridgetown Declaration on non-communicable diseases and mental health. My name is Alicia Nicholls, Junior Research Fellow of the SRC, and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. But first, it is my distinct pleasure to extend a sincere welcome on behalf of our SRC Director, Dr. Janive Remy. Dr. Remy really wanted to be here, but is currently traveling as we speak. However, she joins us in spirit and expresses her deep appreciation to our esteemed panelists who will join us shortly, and to you, the audience, for joining us this afternoon. The SRC's mandate, as many of you know, is as the Caribbean's leading trade policy training, research, and outreach institute, and it involves advancing research and thought leadership, not just on trade issues, but sustainable development issues like public health, which increasingly touches and concerns our core areas of focus. The historic Bridgetown Declaration on NCDs and mental health, which is the subject of this afternoon's webinar, was recently launched at the Small Island Developing States Ministerial held in Barbados, June 14th to 16th. And it recognizes, among other things, that undeniable link between trade and public health policy. And we at the SRC therefore saw this historic declaration agreed to by SIDS and championed by the governments of Barbados and Fiji as an important topic for further discussion. So we featured an SRC Trading Thoughts on it. And of course, this afternoon, we're bringing together our expert panel to talk about how trade and this declaration intersect and how trade can help in achieving its objectives. Lastly, we believe firmly in fostering strategic and meaningful collaboration on these intersecting trade and sustainable development issues with like-minded institutes like the LHRU. And we thank its head, Mrs. Nicole Foster, for her willingness to partner with us on this chat. We also place emphasis on empowering young people and training the trade policy specialists of tomorrow. And for that reason, we're very happy to share that one of our newest researchers, Ms. Adela Lewis, had actually done her research topic looking at this issue of trade and public health as well. So I'll hand over now to the head of the Law and Health Research Unit, our co-host, Mrs. Nicole Foster, for her welcome remarks on behalf of the LHRU. And then I'll switch to my moderator's hat and introduce the rest of our esteemed panelists. Over to you, Mrs. Foster.
Okay, thank you, Alicia, and good afternoon. A warm welcome to everyone to this SRC lunchtime chat that's being co-hosted by the Law and Health Research Unit of the KPhil Law Faculty. The Law and Health Research Unit was launched in July 7th of 2021 as part of the faculty's delayed 50th anniversary celebrations. And since then, we've really been ramping up our work and doing quite a bit. And so we're really very happy to be able to collaborate with our partners, our UE partners. The collaboration and multidisciplinary work is an important part of the UE. And so in that regard, when Alicia reached out, it was, I didn't even have to hesitate in terms of saying, of course, we would partner with her, just in terms of the work of the Law and Health Research Unit. So we celebrated 2 years last July the 7th, because as I said, we would have been founded in 2021. And our work has really been focused on the intersection between law and health in the public policy space. So looking at the use of law as an instrument to promote and support public health, and in particular health in all policies types of approaches to health. In that regard, the Law and Health Research Unit has engaged in a number of initiatives. We have a short course that we offer on Introduction to Global Health Law, as well as currently now we're running our complementary course, NCDs and the law. And all of these issues are very much a part of what we do. We are working closely with partners across the region in terms of trying to do better and to do more in terms of NCD prevention. And in this regard, of course, the Bridgetown Declaration coming out of the recent ministerial meeting held here in Barbados is an important tool in that battle. So once again, welcome. We look forward to continuing to partner with SRC and other like-minded partners, and we look forward to a really wonderful and interesting webinar.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Foster. So now getting into the meat of the matter, I'm putting on my moderator's hat. So the objectives of this webinar really are to increase the understanding of what is this Bridgetown Declaration. We would have heard about it. There was a lot of fanfare about it, but what are its objectives? What have SIDS committed to under it? And to consider how the Bridgetown Declaration could help to address the problems of NCDs and mental health conditions, to explore how trade could assist in achieving these and other public health goals more broadly, and of course, to propose next steps for achieving the objectives of the declaration. And I could not think of a better panel when Mrs. Foster and I were thinking about this. We really couldn't think of a better panel than the persons that we have in front of you this afternoon. And joining me to discuss this are His Excellency Ambassador Matthew Wilson. He's the permanent representative of Barbados to the United Nations and to the WTO and other Geneva-based international organizations. And he's one of the architects of the document, and we are proud to have him. As you know, many of you would know, is a well-known friend to the SRC and is one of our SRC advisory board members. So welcome, Ambassador. Mrs. Nicole Foster, who you just met, is an attorney at law and head of the Law and Health Research Unit. And as many of you would be aware, she is a public health and trade law expert. So we're very happy that not only was she able to join us, but she's able to partner with us on this chat. And of course, Dr. Joy St. John, who again is no stranger to you, is the executive director agency. She's a medical doctor with many years of experience in the public health space, and many of you will also remember that she was Chief Medical Officer. And of course, we have Mr. Pierre Cooke, who is a youth advocate, also no stranger to you. He's a law graduate. He's currently pursuing his legal education certificate, and he's also a technical advisor with Healthy Caribbean Coalition. So ladies and gentlemen, a truly all-star panel. So what we're going to do, we're going to have a round of questions, a couple of rounds of questions, and then we'll open up to Q&A. But in the interim, please feel free to drop those questions, have your lunch, everything, but please have your questions ready, drop them in the Q&A. Please note that Dr. St. John will have to leave by 1:30 due to an existing commitment. So what we'll try to do is to ensure that she will be able to take her questions in case we don't get to the Q&A before the time has elapsed. So we'll start off with Ambassador Wilson. And Ambassador Wilson, I want to start with you because you were one of the architects of the declaration, and SIDS have already agreed to achieving this SDG target 3.4 regarding reducing premature NCD deaths by 1/3 by 2030. So why is it, if we already have this commitment there, why was it that it was needed for SIDS to have this SIDS-specific declaration? Why was it seen as being important for SIDS to have this specific declaration on NCDs and mental health? Over to you, Ambassador.
Thanks a lot, Alicia. And all this talk about lunchtime event, and it's 7 o'clock in the evening here in Geneva. So, that's not really fair. But no, listen, I'm really pleased to be here. This is what you call a panel of Bajan excellence. People I've known for a very long time and who I respect for the work and the commitment that they've been doing in this field. So I'm really my honor, my privilege to be part of this panel. People always say, whenever something goes wrong, they say, don't worry about it. You have your health. You don't have anything to worry about. You didn't get that job. It doesn't matter. You have your health, or once you have your health, nothing matters. But no one ever says that about a country. No one ever says that about the health ecosystem of a country. We talk about debt, we talk about trade, we talk about social unrest. We don't really talk about health from a whole of economy perspective. And the fact of the matter is that an unhealthy population is a slow rot to a country's development trajectory. It's a drag on generational prospects. And when you look at the figures, you have nearly 3/4 of deaths globally are from NCDs. They estimate that about $47 trillion in productivity could be lost by 2025 because of NCDs. And this is why I was so pleased to be involved in this whole process with my brother, the ambassador from Fiji, because this process put health at the center, but also positioned it as part of a wider ecosystem that deals with mental health issues, that deals with climate change, that deals with financing, that deals with partnerships, that deals with trade. So having everything there together and connected, I thought was so incredibly important. And why this declaration and what makes it so important? I want to focus on 3 things. The first is that this was a declaration for SIDS by SIDS, and that should never be taken for granted. And I was in the co-driver's seat here, so I can tell you this was by SIDS for SIDS. Yes, we got really, really important assistance from the WHO Secretariat, but this was us. And frankly, at the very beginning, it was posed to me that we should open this declaration out to negotiate with the full membership of the WHO. And I said, no. I said, I'm not doing that. This has to be something that is specifically about SIDS and comes from the SIDS experience. I'm not opening this to the full membership. If they want to take on board what the SIDS say, that's fine. If they don't want to, that's fine as well. But I'm not going to have the SIDS voice and perspectives watered down as we go into this. And the second thing was the role of the civil society. And I have to tell you, I really got exposed to the work of the NCD Alliance and the Healthy Caribbean Coalition. And I am so impressed. I am impressed by their documentation, by their analysis, by their advocacy, by the way that they approach these things in terms of partnership. So a lot of this that you see in the declaration actually came from civil society and NGOs as well, which was so important to me. Because when we first spoke to the NCD Alliance and the HCC, I told them point blank, I said, I want to do this in partnership with you. We're all in the same direction. We're trying to deal with the same issues, with the same problems, and looking for the same solutions. So let's do this in partnership. So the second thing is, this was very much influenced by the perspectives of civil society. And the third thing is that it really is, if you look at the annex, it really is a menu of action-oriented and solution-focused activities. And this is where we have been quite flexible in allowing countries based on their particularities to decide which of these elements they want to focus on and how fast they want to do it. And this is why there's a commitments page on the WTO website where countries are supposed to actually take from the annex the elements that they want to focus on. And the fourth thing is that, like I said, it very much took a whole of system approach. So it looked at NCDs, but it looked at NCDs from the perspective of behavioral change being necessary, of commercial determinants, of access to alternatives to some of the foods that we're importing. It looked at climate change, and also from the perspective of how climate change is going to impact on food security and food productivity, which also has a huge impact on the fact that we have to import so much food. It looked at mental health both as a cause of maybe sometimes people moving towards situations that lead to increased NCDs, and also an outcome of people struggling and living with NCDs. Then it looked at financing, it looked at partnership, it looked at labeling, it looked at advocacy, it looked at education, and all of this was evidence driven. So if you look at the annex, I mean, I just kind of want to throw a few kind of buzzwords for you, but important words, which I think really do help to solidify where we want to go. Advocacy, local solutions, civil society, people-centered, global coordination, private sector partnership, addressing structural barriers to healthcare, domestic investment, regulation and labeling, behavioral change, education, investing in agriculture and food security systems, and setting targets and monitoring. If you look in the annex, those concepts are dotted throughout the annex. So it really, in a way, reaffirms that if we're going to address this issue of NCDs, mental health, and climate change, it has to be a whole of economy, a whole of ecosystem approach to getting this done. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Wilson. And it's always good when you have the people who were in the room to be able to give you that perspective. And you touched on some really important things here about why it was important for SIDS to have this declaration and the role of civil society, the role that they played in this declaration, in the formation of this declaration. And I want to transition now to Dr. Joy St. John. And Dr. St. John, you are a medical practitioner. You are someone who has many years of experience in the public health arena. Could you tell us your perspectives as a medical doctor and public health expert on the declaration? What are your perspectives, especially given some of the very startling statistics that we know exist with regard to NCDs and mental health conditions in the Caribbean? So over to you, Dr. St. John.
I've been a doctor since 1991, and in the late 90s, I think it was the late 90s, there was a SIDS meeting in Barbados. So for me, this is almost like a coming home perspective. So we talk about me as a doctor. In 2007, I was in the room when the Port of Spain Declaration was agreed to by the heads of government. And then I was on the executive board of WHO when WHO was trying to get global interest in NCDs. And then I was chair of the executive board, and this whole issue of NCDs was a perspective. And then I was hired by Margaret Chan to support the co-facilitators of the UN high-level meeting on NCDs review. And so I was again in the room when there was a review. And then I went back to WHO as an assistant director general with responsibility for climate and other determinants of health. So I had responsibility for a climate change and health initiative for SIDS. So when I saw this, I said, no matter if you have another meeting, you have to be talking about this, because in so many ways, it is a journey, and I have been privileged to be there. Ambassador Wilson was talking about the declaration and the annex. And as I read the annex especially, I saw little points from all of those aspects of the journey that I talked to you about, 2007, the recognition of overseas development assistance needing to come to the SIDS, the discussion about all of our many challenges, including climate change and severe weather events that knock our GDP off by percentage points every time there's an event, over and over again, sometimes more than once in a year. And then we have to deal with NCDs. I just was writing remarks for something I have to do for one of the member states of CARFA. They're launching diabetes guidelines. And I spoke about what I saw when we're talking about the journey, and me as a doctor, what I saw of my patients when I first became a doctor. Hardly any NCDs, and no children having NCDs. And I'm saying, what happened to us? And what happened to us is that we turned away from our culture and our food that we grew, or the stocks that were raised in the yard, and we're importing all of this processed food, and we're not moving like we used to do. I remember spending a day in my summer holiday playing cricket. I remember I had good boy days. I used to climb tree and fly kite. Our children don't do that now. So I have so many things hitting me as a doctor and a public health expert about where we have come and the complexity of the approaches that we need, like the Bridgetown Declaration, to deal with the fix that SIDS, not just Caribbean SIDS, all SIDS, because I've been there. When we did the SIDS, Climate Change and Health SIDS initiative, I went to Fiji, I went to Mauritius, I went to Grenada, and I saw ministers roll up their sleeves, take off the jackets, and sit down and say, this is what we need. So it is really good to be in this journey and see Ambassador Wilson being one of the scribes, the drivers of something that touches all the points in that journey.
Thank you so much, Dr. St. John. And I mean, I really liked your intervention because you gave us a lot of the history behind it. You also talked about that climate change link, which is something that was also made very clear in the declaration, the whole link with climate change, and also the cultural aspects as well. The fact that we're not eating what we grow, we're eating a lot of processed foods. And that brings me now to Mrs. Nicole Foster, who is a trade expert and attorney at law. And you do a lot of work with Healthy Caribbean Coalition. So this is right up your alley. So with regard to the declaration, what is your perspective as a trade and health law expert on the declaration?
Thanks very much.
Mrs. Foster.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alicia. And so really, I'm going to start off a little bit by drawing on what Ambassador Wilson and Dr. St. John would have started off with, both of which I endorse fully. I think they have highlighted key dimensions of the journey and the document. And so I start off there in terms of saying that absolutely, you know, even as an outsider, so I wasn't privileged like Dr. St. John to be there from the very beginning. But of course, you hear about all of these steps along the journey. And so really to see them coming together and not only just coming together, but us continuing as SIDS to advocate. So it's been a long, hard journey, as Dr. St. John will testify, but it is one that SIDS remain committed to. And that has been really, really a powerful message coming out of the declaration for me, as I said, as someone involved in the process, but as a stakeholder only and not from the very beginning. The other striking element for me, just once again, from that broader sort of third-party perspective, is how we are seeing the SIDS NCD agenda encapsulating other areas, right? So you mentioned about climate change, other areas that are of critical importance to SIDS. And so we see how something like climate change, which very much, you know, a few years ago, a few decades ago, maybe we thought was an environmental issue, right? Only environmentalists spoke about, you know, the issues related to climate change, etc. And we weren't maybe as engaged as we needed to be. And now today we're understanding, as we always say, health is in all things, right? And we understand how something like climate change, which initially might have seen something divorced from health or divorced something that SIDS in particular didn't have a stake in, besides the obvious one of the sea level rise, etc. From an environmental perspective, we're seeing now how this too is a critical part of the SIDS agenda, but in particular the SIDS health agenda as it relates to NCDs. And this just shows us, in a sense, to me, what it reinforces as well is how interconnected this NCD space is. Because even sort of shifting slightly, if we think about something like COVID, so we normally, I saw a meme on Twitter a few days ago where they were saying, you know, this division that we make between infectious and non-infectious diseases is a false divide, because, you know, COVID has taught us that, you know, there's not really a difference, because the ones who suffered the most in the context of COVID were who? Those with the NCDs. And who are the ones with the highest levels of NCDs globally? The SIDS. So we're coming full circle in a sense, as Dr. St. John so powerfully said. Another bit that struck me was the inclusion of some new issues. So because climate change is new, maybe in terms of its connections with health, but not a new issue, but something that is new within the health space that has got some good prominence within the declaration. And I think that's a very important step for SIDS, is the whole discussion around commercial determinants of health and conflicts of interest. Those are key issues for us in the SIDS space. One of the big challenges we have is managing conflict of interest. How do you, in small communities where everybody knows everybody, or one person wears like 5 different hats, 2 of which might be health promoting, and the other 3 which might be health undermining, how do we set up systems that allow us to still progress, to still develop, but to do so in a way that is not harmful to our overall health objectives? And I really give kudos to the ambassador and his co-chair and the others more broadly involved in drafting it, in terms of very much putting this on the agenda. Otherwise, from a sort of where now my health and trade hats, law and trade hats, what has also been striking to me is the strong emphasis on trade as a driver in this process, the recognition, the explicit recognition. In many ways, there's a specific mention of flexibilities within GATT Article 20 and the need for persons to utilize those maybe more effectively and build the capacity to do so. There's many of the policies, such as marketing, dealing with the marketing of unhealthy food and beverages to children as it relates to, our attempts to deal with our childhood obesity problem. That is clearly a trade issue, and the specific mention, again, front of pack warning labels. So a real clear understanding that trade is a key driver in this process, but then also that law is. So often, even to today, whenever I tell people that, the faculty has this unit called the Law and Health Research Unit, and they don't understand, but what do y'all do, right? Or they think we deal with the technical medical issues like medical negligence and, that sort of a thing. And you're trying to explain to them that there's a whole, when we think about the WHO best buys, which are, of course, the recommendations from WHO in terms of the most effective and cost-effective measures, interventions that can deal with NCDs from a prevention control. I think there's about 16, I think at least about 12 of them are based on law. You can't realize them without utilizing the law. So equally, as a lawyer and as somebody working in the intersection, in the space of the intersection between law and health as it relates to both trade and human rights, it was quite gratifying to see that recognition being reflected there, whether, as I said, it is in the context of specifically mentioning legal text within the WTO space that provides some options for us, but also throughout the document, there's a strong emphasis on rights-based approaches, orienting our conversations and our responses to premise them in terms of our human rights obligations, and that equally is key. So that's sort of the main key takeaways, jump out at me kind of points that came to mind when I went through the document. Over.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Foster. And you brought out so many important points there. In terms of because we often think about these things as separate issues, but increasingly we have to realize that all of them are interconnected. So you brought in the whole issue of trade, even human rights, climate change, etc. We're going to another issue, which is the youth. And we are very happy to have Mr. Pierre Cooke Jr., who is, as I said, no stranger to this space. None of these wonderful panelists is. And Mr. Cooke, you would have done a lot of advocacy with regard to the youth in particular, and the youth in terms of health and mental health as well. So what is your perspective on, as somebody who is part of the next generation, what's your perspective on this declaration?
Yeah, thank you very much. I often say it's difficult to follow up in these interventions after Ms. Foster, because she usually gives all the talking points that I like to speak on. But I was happy to see this declaration come about, and I was happy to see that it was SIDS-led. One of the things that I reiterate in my advocacy is that there should be nothing for the youth without the youth. And necessarily when we were creating this conversation around a SIDS declaration, I was very happy to see that for something to be addressing issues amongst its country, it was done by us. And so I was really happy that it was led and created internally. Some of the things that stood out to me, and especially within the space of mental health, first of all, the mention of mental health was impressive and brilliant for me. Oftentimes we have conversations around the protection, prevention, and dealing with NCDs, and mental health isn't explicitly mentioned, and persons forget that it's a part of that system. So I was happy initially to see that explicit mention of mental health as part of the declaration. And so oftentimes you may not think or understand the connection between mental health and trade policies and how those two things can be intertwined. But that's a different conversation that will take a lot more discussion, I believe. But some of the things that I was happy to see as well within the declaration was really this conversation around small island developing states and our unique experiences. Recently, I assisted in writing a paper on the experience of small island developing states and mental health. And one of the things that we stress is this idea of climate anxiety. Climate anxiety being that within small island developing states, there's a period of time every year when we're a bit more anxious than we usually would be, and that would be the hurricane season. Everyone is on high alert. You're on high alert when the rain starts falling a bit harder. You're on high alert when the winds are picking up. You're on high alert when a storm is approaching. And we often don't think about the connection between that type of anxiety and our mental health and well-being. And so as small island developing states, that is something that is unique to us. This experience with waiting and anticipating and being scared or worried about the potential impacts and after effects of a major climate or natural disaster. Beyond that, we have countries who have already been affected by major hurricanes and disasters, and they themselves, especially young persons, have spoken to what the anxiety is like after those effects. So I've had students and friends, for example, in Dominica, when they were affected by their major hurricane, who were worried about whether they could continue their studies, whether they could continue to go to UE, whether their parents could afford to continue to send them to school. And so as a young person seeing this declaration and seeing the strong focus on small island developing states and our unique experiences, I feel proud and I feel a bit more confident about what our future can look like. You know, I say again that the decisions that are made today by the World Health Organizations, by the UNs, by the international organizations of the world, those decisions affect our future. We're going to inherit the earth. Under the normal circumstances of things, I may be here a bit longer than some people. And so the decisions that are made at this point in time will affect our future. And so I was also happy that I got a chance to contribute to the development of the declaration. The Healthy Caribbean Coalition was very keen on ensuring that as their youth technical advisor, I was a part of the process in saying, well, what do we as young people want to see reflected in an international declaration, a declaration of this magnitude? What do we want to see represented? And I saw it, the funding for mental health care and support systems, the call for improved systems to tend to mental health challenges, the conversations around being culturally appropriate in our responses to NCDs and even the climate change challenge and mental health situations. And to see that type of intervention and responses reflected in something at this level, I'm really happy. And I think young persons, when we take a closer look at this and in years to come, it's something that we can sit and be proud of. For years, the Caribbean, we've been, and small island developing states in general have been the canaries in the coal mine. For years, we've had to be the ones leading the charge. The Port of Spain 2007 declaration, the first of its kind. NCDs didn't first pop up in 2007, but we were the ones who had to come together and say something needs to be done, and we're going to be the ones to do it. So again, I'm glad that we're leading this charge, and I'm glad that the youth voice was included, and especially happy that mental health is receiving a major focus in this way.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cooke. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we did in this first round of questions was to basically get from the panelists what are their thoughts on the declaration. So, transitioning into the next round, and before I do, I just wanted to note one or two things that Mr. Cooke said, because he mentioned the very important issue of climate anxiety, and many of us don't really think about it, but you could clearly see the impact that those things could have on that hurricanes or the mere announcement of a hurricane or anything like that could have on your mental health, even especially if you're someone who has lived through a hurricane and that sort of thing. So it comes back to this whole intersectionality thing that we've been talking about, the fact that we can't look at these things as separate silos. All of these things are interconnected. And I'll transition now back to Dr. Joy St. John. And Dr. St. John, I'm following up with you because coming on the back of what Mr. Cooke has said, given the youth perspective, you had in your initial introduction, you had talked a bit about some of the cultural challenges. So things like dietary habits, the fact that you as a medical professional, you are seeing persons, who are young, presenting as obese. What do you think are some of the obstacles to changing these lifestyle habits, and more importantly, to achieving our public health goals in the region? And on the back of that, I also wanted to find out from you, what are some concrete things you wish to see implemented if we are to reduce our NCD burden and reduce the incidence of mental health conditions? I'm giving you these two questions now because I'm aware that you have to leave by 1:30. So I hand over to you.
Well, I always like to say that in the Caribbean, we will have death by appetite. We like how our food tastes. And when it is sweet and salty and full of fat, we are happy. And I think we have to address that. The fact that culturally, we have changed our baseline of what is good for us to eat. We used to be satisfied with things that were less sweet, less salt, had less fat. So this whole issue about, let me jump over to your other question, this whole issue about product reformulation, labeling of foods, the education of persons so they know to look for what's in the food they're buying. These are some of the ways in which we can try to reduce death by appetite. I remember years ago, before there was a CARFA, saying to CFNI, Caribbean Food and Nutrition Institute of PAHO Institute, and one of the precursor institutions, regional health institutions that went into producing CARFA. I remember saying, can we get foods, snack foods that come from the Caribbean? And the private sector filled in that bill with breadfruit chips, plantain chips, and other nice snacks, coconut snacks with cinnamon and salt, which are also good for you and not too heavy in the salt, sugar, and fat. And so the marriage, when we talk from the first question, when we talk of whole of society, the marriage between what is good for us and its availability in our markets is something that we need to foster. So that's one of the first sets of answers to both questions. Another big obstacle is going to be the fact that priorities, because of COVID, priorities have shifted away from health and unfortunately towards supporting some of the drivers of commercial determinants of health. A phrase that I think we need to unpack more for our audience because not everybody may understand it. There are causes behind the causes with health. Most of the things that cause ill health have their origin outside of the health sector. So when we talk about determinants of health, that's what we mean. Commercial determinants of health, therefore, would be the things that make money, that drive on things that make us unwell. The obvious examples are foods that are high in sugar, fat, and salt. But we need to understand that it is a microcosm in the Caribbean. Our economies are in the world context, our economies are small. So everything is interconnected. A lot of money was pumped into the fight against COVID-19. And so there are some shifts towards things that support the drivers of the commercial determinants of ill health. What are some of the concrete things that I would wish to happen to see that mitigated and therefore reduce the burden of NCDs? At the regional level, we have a very interesting set of initiatives that have been determined by the ministers of health getting together with the ministers of trade and talking about regional policy. One of them is the 6-point policy package on NCDs. It originally was to fight childhood obesity, but it has several elements. And what we at the regional level do is that we get together, CARICOM institutions, regional institutions like PAHO, global institutions like UN institutions, we get together and we find ways within our budgets to deal with some of the policy initiatives. One of them would be labeling of foods. One of them would be school nutrition policies. So that's an interesting policy initiative that we need to support and keep driving, because without a huge injection of funds, we use our own budgets, we keep certain initiatives going. The other initiative, which is the getting together of trade and health. Trade is where a lot of the commercial determinants of health can interplay with the population. We have the Intergovernmental Working Group. This is member states, representatives from trade and health getting together and talking about policy. And right now they're talking about foods and trying to address foods high in salt, sugar, and fat. We're working on trans fats. And these are two things that I would like to see addressed. And one last thing, answering your two questions all at the same time. The next thing that I would like to address is the false sense of security that the slow burn of NCDs means. People think, oh, there's something old people get, so I don't have to worry about the food I eat. No, I don't have to worry if I sit in front of the TV instead of being active. We have to change the mindset. We've got to manage the misinformation and disinformation that a little food can hurt you. A little food can hurt you. We've got to dispel this false sense of security that we don't have to do anything about it. No, we don't have to make sure that there's water in our schools. We don't have to make sure that children in our schools are exercising. They're young, they can burn it off anyhow. We have to implement initiatives now. What are the ways to do that? Well, it's a combination of communication, risk communication, so that we dispel the myths from the general public's mind. And I don't want them to think they're in this alone, it's personal responsibility. No, it is the responsibility of governments and the regional space, because the regional space does things for the Caribbean. It's the responsibility of governments in the regional space to have environments that are designed to allow people to make the right choice, the healthy choice, the easy choice. So we've got to have communications and policy initiatives like taxes on sugary drinks, like having a day when instead of cars on the road, there are people on the roads walking. Those kinds of things to try to dispel the myth of the slow burn of NCDs. Over.
Thank you so much, Dr. St. John. And I like many of the suggestions that you made, and a lot of these things are things that touch on what Mrs. Foster likely will raise when I come to her shortly to give us the trade perspective. But I just wanted to just note for the audience that Dr. St. John has to leave at 1:30. So if you do have any burning questions for her, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and I will refer them to her before she leaves.
They don't all have to be burning, you know, they can be cool questions too.
Very well. I like that. So ladies and gentlemen, we'll move over now so thank you, Dr. St. John, for giving us the perspective of someone who's a public health practitioner. We move now to the trade aspect. And one of the misconceptions, Mrs. Foster, out there, as you know, is that our public health measures are constrained or even hindered by our WTO obligations. And I wanted to find out to what extent is this really the case, that things like front of package labeling and some of the other initiatives that taxes, for instance, on sugary beverages, and to what extent are those things constrained or maybe even encouraged by the WTO in terms of the exceptions out there? Over to you, Mrs. Foster.
Thanks very much, Alicia. And yeah, so I mean, it is a pervasive feeling. You often come up against it, this sense that there's some inevitable, insurmountable conflict between trade and health on the one hand. And I must say that I am not of that camp. So I guess maybe because I came into it, so it tends to be a lot of the times persons who take very strong views on this, maybe public health law persons who are now, you know, interacting with the trade just in terms of the clashes that happen, right? I came into this space through trade. So I used to work with Matthew in the mission, right? So I actually came into the health space as a trade lawyer. And so perhaps then being in a way predisposed to looking at trade maybe in a little bit more positive light than would normally be the case. And I'm really trying to open myself to what are the possibilities. And I'm not suggesting that they can't be conflicts, absolutely. But are there some insurmountable? No. Are they inevitable? No. And so just let me unpack that a little bit. So really, when we think about trade and the restrictions, let us say, the obligations that we sign on to that might create challenges for us or that we have to take account of, pay attention to as we seek to structure effective, wholesome, comprehensive public health policies, we would want to be thinking about things like non-discrimination, right? We would want to be thinking about specifically, as the Bridgetown Declaration mentions, Article 20 of the GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is the core document within the WTO system. But that too is complemented by some specialized agreements, such as, for example, the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, which is the relevant agreement when we're talking about, for example, front of pack warning labels. But taking those two as maybe our core, the core space, which creates a little breathing room for health, what those two spaces say is, those two agreements say is, look, you can pursue health, but you need to pursue it in a way that is non-discriminatory, in a way that is truly about health. And therefore, really, what is critical in terms of ensuring that you can do what you need to do is to have the evidence and data that supports a causal connection between, the public health issue that you are trying to address and the particular response that you are articulating. And let's be clear, the WTO can't tell anybody, oh, that's not an important issue for you to try to address. States have absolutely the ability to make the call as to what is important to them from a health perspective or not. What the WTO rules and related rules will say is, if you want to address that, there may be some particular considerations that you need to bear in mind in trying to pursue that goal. And key, really critical, is the non-discrimination. And so I think a lot of times, and to me, that's not problematic, because if it's really about health, it shouldn't be non-discriminatory, right? If we're really about promoting the health goal, it doesn't matter where the sugar comes from. Dr. St. John will hold me up, I'm sure, in saying that the sugar will affect me the same whether it comes from Barbados or if it comes from the United States of America, right? It doesn't, sugar is sugar, right? And so you want to make sure that so really, rather than an inevitable conflict, what I will say is that the trade obligations really put a responsibility on governments to ensure that they carefully analyze and draft their policies in a way that is in alignment with the policy space that is there. So the WTO from 2001, the appellate body, which is now, in abeyance, but the appellate body of the WTO since 2001 in the EC asbestos case, recognized public health as a goal, as a value that was important to the highest degree. And so what happens is, in that space, you have to balance, right? Balance what's the impact from a trade as against the value. But when you have a value that's important to the highest degree, it's not that hard to balance it in the health favor. Once it's non-discriminatory, once you have the evidence that supports the necessary causal, connection between what you're doing and how it's going to lead long-term to where you want to go. And in that regard as well, you have to pay attention to how you articulate your goal. If we say our goal is to get rid of NCDs, well, Dr. St. John would be able to tell you that's not anything that any one policy is going to give us. So then we're setting ourselves up to fail. Right? So maybe, for example, with something as Dr. St. John mentioned, with something like front of part warning labels, what we want to be saying is we want to enable persons to make informed choices about what are healthy options in the context of what is presented to them in the supermarket, right? And we know that down the road, once eating changes and practices changes complemented with other things, then we will see this knock-on effect in terms of reduction in obesity and our NCD burden overall. So the other thing that I wanted to say is all of this then is possible. And of course, I shouldn't omit to mention that, and Dr. St. John was talking about the commercial determinants of health. So one of the things that industry does is to threaten legal action against you. Oh, if you do that, we're going to sue you. Right? And so we saw that, for example, not in this specific space of, no, it's NCDs, because it's not diet alone we're talking about, it's NCDs as a whole, which includes tobacco control. And so we would have seen that, for example, with Australia. When Australia first indicated that they were going to implement plain packaging, Philip Morris, etc., said, you do that, we'll sue you. And to be fair, they did sue them. It wasn't a bluff. But the point was that Australia had done the homework. They knew that they had done what they needed to do. They ticked their boxes. And guess what? The WTO upheld their measures both times, at the panel level and at the appellate body level. So I keep on saying, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Sorry for the imagery, but you get what I mean, right? The proof of the pudding is in the eating, and the WTO has proven time and time and again that if you really have a genuine health measure and you have the evidence to support it and it's non-discriminatory, they're actually going to allow you to have your measure. And so regulatory chill, as they call it, is definitely a factor. So a lot of people, were kind of waiting to see, who were maybe thinking about doing it, said, nah, let Australia go forward. Let's see what happens with them. And then, depending on what happens, we'll decide whether we implement or not. But we have quite a bit of jurisprudence that speaks to the fact that, the space is legitimately there. Obviously, it does take some courage still to bite that bullet and decide that you're going to step out into that space. And in that regard, you need to do your homework. You need to have done the evidence and drafted your policies. And in my final point then relates to how do we get there? So, it's all well and good to talk about the potential, and yes, Article 20 is there, and yes, Article 2 of the TBT agreement is there. So why haven't we done more? We've all belonged to the WTO, majority of us since 1995. And the fact of the matter is that we have a capacity constraint, right? And we understand that. And that is why the declaration does speak to the need to build some capacity for these countries to be able to more effectively leverage the policy spaces that are available through things like Article 20 of the GATT and Article 2 of the TBT agreement. But I also, besides that board, and it's something, it's so funny because none of us discussed what we were going to speak beforehand, but as Dr. St. John was speaking, I was like, yes, that resonated with me, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And so what I wanted to highlight is the governance issues that requires. If we really want to be able to use trade effectively, if we really to promote our public health goals, if we really want to ensure that trade is not a hindrance to our achievement of our public health goals, we have to have better governance in terms of the creation of policy, in terms of our participation in meetings and these things, so that we really have the health in our policies approach that we've been speaking about for decades. So for example, we don't have, the Ministry of Health coming up to WHO without trade having had an input into that, whatever, if we're discussing, so everybody's at the table. For a concrete example, front to part warning labels, kudos to Barbados, and I'm not saying this because I'm Barbadian, but kudos to Barbados. So front to part warning labels is led by the Ministry of Trade, Foreign Trade and Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. The minister who is holding the trade portfolio being at the time Sandra Husbands. And but they made sure to talk to everybody. So they were setting forth a position as trade, but when they put forward that position as trade, they made sure that they engaged with the health stakeholders before. And so then they were able to marry their trade expertise with what health was saying to them and come up with a reasonable national position, which is one that says, this is a serious health problem. We have to address it. We will address it using the tools that the WTO allows us to use, even though there may be some negative trade impacts in the short term. We'll work with our partners to see how, our trade stakeholders, to see how we can offset some of that. And so that's really where we need to be going in terms of doing better. So there's capacity to be built generally because we don't have necessarily, and of course, places like SRC, et cetera, come in here in terms of building that capacity to do the analysis. But I stress here, the analysis has to be by lawyers because we know it is a legal process, right, that we're engaging in. But then also, besides getting that capacity, I think there's so much more that we can do as it's at the level of government. I don't know, Matthew might want to, sorry, Ambassador Wilson might want to, I slipped there, might wish to jump in here, but just in terms of how we organize ourselves as government, who we speak to. He would have mentioned, one of the first things he did was, as ambassador and co-chair of the process, was to reach out to civil society and say, look, we want to have conversations with you because we're going to integrate and there was a back and forth. It wasn't us lecturing to them or them lecturing to us. There was a genuine conversation and sharing of views. And so it means then that when he goes into the meeting and has to negotiate with the remaining SIDS about what stays and what goes and whatever, of course, he's more empowered and more informed, and we can get a better outcome document. And it's little things like that. It does not necessitate, it would be great if we could have formal structures that, make these things happen, but we know our challenges, right? Resource-wise and both financial and human resource, but there are lots of things that we can do in terms of doing more conversations. And as I said, and maybe stop at this point and maybe let Ambassador Wilson jump in, because I know this is something that he is very keen on in terms of bringing in a whole of society voice and not having a sense of foreign affairs being this little silo that is, self-contained and, only the diplomats and only the diplomats within foreign affairs are talking to each other.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Foster. So much to unpack there, but it's like you read my mind, because I was going to go to Ambassador Wilson next. So Ambassador Wilson, your reactions to what Mrs. Foster said, and specifically what I wanted to find out from you was, what are some ways you envision CIS working together to achieve the objectives of this declaration? So over to you, Ambassador Wilson.
Thanks. I mean, some really, really rich points that were raised, and I just want to throw out some responses to what I've heard from Dr. St. Joy, Dr. Foster, and Pierre. Look, let me just pull back the curtain a little bit. When we were first given the assignment to do this declaration, I did not understand why on earth we were doing a declaration on NCDs, climate change, and mental health. I said to myself, is this an error? Have they included mental health in error? Well, I don't know why they're putting all this together, So this was also an education for us, an education that when you're a small country and you're faced with all of these issues all at once, sometimes the best thing to do is you own the packaging of it. You own how you connect the dots. You show the outside world and your partners why these things interact with each other and how there are different levers that can be used. Also, I will say, Nicole, the conflict of interest element, that almost didn't make it in. That almost did not make it in. So this was not this was not an easy a process as it seemed to be. I have a colleague of mine, Tahara, who is on the call right now. She was shadowing me when she was here with the SRC team, and she was in the room with Barbados and Fiji, who were co-chairs of this, and we were negotiating ourselves over the use of 2 or 3 words. I mean, Nicole, you know how it goes, You negotiate 2 or 3 words. It was only out of that meeting, actually, based on a suggestion, I might add, from an SRC student, that we ended up having the final declaration divided into a declaration plus 2 annexes. And because what we had initially done was we chose from the annex 2 what we think should be the first tier issues that countries should look at, and then we had other issues. But then we thought, well, who are we to determine what different countries with their peculiarities decide as priorities? So we put them all there in a list for countries themselves to decide. On issues of NCDs, I mean, this goes back to a lot of things that Dr. St. Joy said. That one of the biggest problems we have in the Caribbean, honestly, is that we personalize and we blame people for having NCDs. We blame them. And if you blame people, if you make them feel like victims, you're not going to get the kind of behavioral change that you need, and you're not going to have people wanting to access healthcare as they should, and you're not going to have people speaking their truth as they should. So there's some behavioral change there that needs to happen as well. This declaration was not put together by accident. It is people-centered on purpose. It's not about just rules and regulations and trade rules. It is people-centered on purpose, because as small economies, that is really what drives our economies moving forward, our people. And then in terms of looking at coping strategies, you can't shame people into healthy lifestyles. You can't shame them, and you also cannot use trade as a way to restrict people from accessing certain things, because remember, at the core here is also the concept of moderation. It's not about cutting out altogether, it's about having coping skills and moderation. So I also am not a big believer in us using trade as a way to stop certain foods from coming into the country, because at the end of the day, we still have to give people freedom of choice, but we need to give them freedom of choice by also giving them the tools to be able to make the right decisions. And I want to go then to a question that was raised by Christian, I think it is in the chat, and completely correct. I'm sorry, when I'm home and I go to Chefette and you tell me that I have to pay, I guess now it's about $10 for a roti or so. And also $10 for, okay, and $10 for a salad. I'm sorry. I'm choosing a roti, yeah? Honestly. So you have to find a way to also make healthy foods more accessible to people. And that means that we also need to do better with growing the healthy foods that we need and distributing it properly and showcasing it properly as well. But then there you have the impact of climate change, because climate change is making us have less agricultural yields. Is completely messing up our soil. So that even, agriculture is not as easy as it was, let's say 20 years ago, So all of this thing is in one really challenging package that we need to unpack. And here, look, the Caribbean is a graveyard of great policies and great intentions. We have policies that we could start together and be higher than the central bank. So what I want is that this document is operational, that we measure, we monitor, and we hold people accountable. And this is where people like Pierre come in, where you hold governments accountable for what they're doing or not doing, where the HCC comes in and holds people accountable, where academics come in and hold people accountable. So, I mean, that for me is absolutely critical. Now, to respond to your last question, Alicia, what do we? Where do I see the next steps to be? Like I said, we can't let the declaration die with the meeting. We can't let the declaration die with the meeting. And we need to identify both health and development champions back home who will advocate for this. This is not going to happen organically. And I'm not even sure, I have to be very careful what I say because I'm now an employee of the government of Barbados. So Nicole asked me a question which I would, be very conscious about answering on camera. But I will say that these things you have to be intentional about making these things happen. The third thing is, as I mentioned, I'm calling for the NCD Alliance, the HCC, for Pierre and his cabal of brave young people to keep up the pressure, And then the fourth thing is we need to introduce this declaration into the mainstream. Now, an easier way to have gotten it into the mainstream earlier might have been to do what I was advised to do, which is negotiate with every single WHO member and have this be a kind of WHO declaration, which probably we could have gone buy-in, but it would have been a watered down version of what we have here today. And I wasn't willing to do that, and Fiji wasn't willing to do that. So we have to find intelligent ways to get it into the mainstream of the WHO. So this has to be presented in the WHO. It has to be presented into the upcoming UN processes. It has to find its way into our CARICOM machinery. CARFA as well needs to be using this as a blueprint. PAHO needs to be using this as a blueprint as well. And then fifth, it needs to be financed. I'm sorry, at the end of the day, we don't like to talk money, but money is what will make this happen. And we need to be intentional about that, both domestic investment, getting the private sector on board, and then also looking for development assistance or a combination of those three. And then final thing I wanted to talk about is you had all mentioned about the private sectors and the producers of some of this food. Look, I love Shirley biscuits. Anybody would tell you that. If you want to make me a happy man, send me a box of Shirley biscuits, the original kind. But if you happen to look at the sugar content of some of this, it would scare you into thinking twice about it, right? So labeling does work if it is accessible, if people know where to look and what to look for. We have a serious problem in the Caribbean where we have the most amazing foods in the Caribbean, but I would say 3/4 of them do not have nutritional content on their packaging. The global calorie counters or nutritional counters don't take on board our traditional indigenous food in the Caribbean. So I've already spoken to, through the HCC, about NUI doing something, having a project where you can actually provide the nutritional values of the traditional foods that we eat in the Caribbean. And then finally on trade, because obviously, I'm the representative to the WTO. Do not hide behind trade rules. A lot of people, a lot of countries like to hide behind trade rules. As Nicole was saying, they are not half as restrictive as people believe they are. Plot and determine your policy that works for you, and then maybe do a mapping to see where they're aligned. But don't start by saying trade rules are not going to allow us to do something. Start first with identifying what it is that you need to move your economy and your country and keep your people safe and healthy, and then take it from there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Wilson. Is like ladies and gentlemen, we have no rehearsal for this, but yet they're so able to predict what each other is going to say and hand over nicely to who I had identified as coming next. And yes, Mr. Cooke, you're up next, as you can imagine. So Ambassador Wilson set up very nicely for us in terms of next steps, and I'll be coming to each of you talking about the next steps. And I wanted to get from you, Mr. Cooke, as a youth advocate on the panel, two things I wanted to get from you. So we know that there's been an increasing incidence of NCDs, NCD risk factors, and mental health conditions among the youth. I want to know from you, how do you think we could get the youth more involved in taking charge of their own health? And I also wanted to get from you, how do you envision the youth playing a part in SIDS health policy making, which is something I know you've advocated very eloquently and stridently for. So over to you, Mr. Cooke.
Yeah, so I'll answer the last question first in terms of how do I envision youth being a part of this process. And partially it's exactly as Ambassador Wilson said, which is holding governments accountable, holding these stakeholders accountable. I mean, I've organically started the process because we had this meeting in June 14th to 16th, I think it was. We had another meeting recently, and I asked the question, what has happened since the declaration? What have we done as states who've committed to this action? To help implement some of these things that we have committed to. And again, as Ambassador Wilson said, and we've all reiterated, there is a finance issue, there is a capacity issue, and there is an issue with the availability of evidence. One of the things I find often when I'm developing conversations around mental health policies and calling for interventions to support the mental health system in the Caribbean is that there's a lack of data. There's a lack of data about how many persons are affected, how many persons seek out the services, how the quality of the services. And so that in a way, I see us as young people stepping forward and helping to hold governments accountable. But beyond the accountability measure, what I would love to see in all spaces is for young persons to be engaged in the process in a critical way, in a meaningful way. So I said I did have the opportunity to contribute in some way to the development of this piece, but I would like to see young persons in the room at the highest level being a part of the conversations, because lived experiences are important. And when you have someone who's a part of the process saying, we are not calling for this just as an arbitrary measure, we're not calling for this just as a measure to gain political points, but we're calling for this because people like Pierre struggled with getting access to medication. We're calling for this because we have had a situation where there have been 3 or 4 persons dying by suicides within the last 4 weeks. That is why we're asking for these policies. And so I want young persons to be in the room so that we can help to give and share this perspective and in some ways drive the way we go with these declarations. One of the things I was concerned about in terms of the NCD space and mental health, we have an issue with the services that are provided, the quality of services that are provided. And that's one of the more significant hindrances to getting young persons involved in, I think you said championing or kind of managing our own health. I often say to people, everyone should seek therapy. Everyone should have at least one therapy session. I often say to people, take care of your mental health. I tweet it all the time. But the reality is the cost of seeking these services, it's scary. And again, lived experiences just within the last 2 weeks, I think I've spent the equivalent of $400 in catering to my mental health. And that paints a picture for you, because the average 16-year-old, 17-year-old doesn't have the personal capacity, the financial capacity to do that. But we have, again, public health systems across the Caribbean and across small island developing states that are underfunded. And so it's not a situation where you can say we are pointing all young people to the public system, because even there, the quality of services is low. And to just pull in the trade aspect to the mental health conversation, and I know for me initially, like Ambassador Wilson, I was thinking, well, how does mental health fit into the trade discussion? And thinking of trade in a facilitative way, GATT provides for an increase in access to healthcare services. It provides for an increase in access to services from personnel, exchange of information. And right now we're in a situation where, for example, persons who struggle with ADHD, who may need stimulants, Concerta as a necessary medication is lacking across the Caribbean, in Trinidad, in Barbados, further up the island chain. And we understand that trade also provides for us to engage in conversations where we can see how we can make the exchange and access to these types of medication easier. And so you kind of make that connection between trade, mental health, NCDs, the climate, it's all there. And I don't think any other group of persons, group of states would have been better to pull it all together than small island developing states, than Caribbean states, because it is our reality. Funding is always an issue for us. Being heard on the global stage is always an issue for us. So coming together in a sort of coalition and putting this call to action out there, I think was a brilliant initiative. Dr. St. John and the other panelists as well spoke to the issue of food and palate. And as a young person, I've grown up in a society where I appreciate some fried food or sweeter foods. On Sundays, you have a handful of rice, a handful of meat, a handful of salad. And that's the diet that we've grown accustomed to. I was doing some research, and in the Caribbean especially, more than 80% of our food is imported. And the quality of that food is poor. And so when you talk about trade and you talk about GATT Article 20, you're looking at how we can use that as a facilitative tool to say, okay, great. We know we have to import food into our country because we don't have the land mass and capacity to produce food for everyone or grow food for everyone. But how can we ensure the food that is imported is of a certain quality? And that is where we have that conversation about using those facilitative measures within the trade system to kind of get better food into us. I had asked the question to Ms. Foster before, because one of the first things that jumped out to me when we started talking about front of package warning label is, how are we going to do this? How are we going to implement this without infringing on our trade obligations? How are we going to put this big label on the front of person's food packaging or their food products without them arguing, well, you're making it a bit more difficult for me to get my product out there? It's a little too restrictive. But we have this brilliant piece in Article 20, which speaks to the facilitative measure. Once it's not arbitrary, once it's a legitimate measure, once you're really speaking to this public health issue, you can implement these measures to protect your public's and population's health. One of the more graphic ways of thinking about it is within COVID-19, we saw countries who said, we're not exporting ventilators because we need them. We're not exporting masks because we need them. And we're not sending them to you because our population needs them a bit more. And even during that context and during that time, persons thought, well, this is a little restrictive. Maybe there should be some laws against this. Maybe someone should bring a case against this country to say, well, hey, you can't restrict us from having access to these things. But in the same way, we can use that same facilitative tool to say, people in small island developing states deserve access to quality foods. One of the terms I saw in the declaration I was happy again to see was rights-based approach to NCDs, mental health, and climate change. And we all have a right to health, and not just health, but when you look at the general comment on the right to health, it speaks to the highest attainable standard of health. And again, we have the right to food and we have the right to nutrition, the highest attainable standard of food and nutrition. And it doesn't mean that because we're in small island developing states, it doesn't mean because we're considered middle income countries that we should take the worst of things. And I think this is why this declaration, this is why this call to action is important. What I would really like to see is this commitment on paper be driven to action. Very often we have declarations, very often we have conversations, very often we have policies where we say that as a Caribbean region, we were the first to put this together. We were the first to say this. We have been saying this for a while. But the issue is sometimes that we don't have we don't see a continuation of the political will, and we don't see a continuation in terms of the actual action in getting things done. But I'm going to be fair in that comment in saying that there's always that issue with financing these programs. There's always that issue with financing these interventions, but we do need governments to be a bit more dedicated to the NCD issue. We've painted the picture several times over about the impact NCDs and mental health can have on your workforce, your ability to produce, the ability of the public servants to produce. And that doesn't seem to be getting the message across there. We're trying to think of more creative ways to get that message out there, but we need governments to just understand that as people who are in charge of a society, as people who we have relinquished certain rights to so that you can govern on our behalf, you have a responsibility to look out for our best interests. And that includes ensuring we have access to quality food, quality health care, and that we have the best policies in place to protect our people.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cooke. Again, so much to unpack there, but I'm aware that we only have 10 more minutes. That's not saying that we couldn't speak forever, because this is a very interesting topic. But I just wanted to, before I get to Mrs. Foster for her views on next steps, I just wanted to note here the question that Ambassador had referred to: how do we encourage healthier eating when non-healthy foods cost far less? Ambassador spoke to that. And also with regard to the question, how do we get governments and their respective ministers to understand that time is overdue for licensed therapists and psychiatrists? I think part of that comes back to what you were saying, Mr. Cooke, in terms of having that data there to show that, look, this is the very serious mental health burden that many of our young people face. And you spoke about the very prohibitive, and honestly, you nearly blew me away with that quote that you gave. So definitely it would be useful to at least have those in schools. So from that level, persons are not just comfortable with seeking therapy, which I think all of us really could use, but also, they will have more cost-effective sources there of counseling, etc. So in the few minutes that remain, I'll go over now to Mrs. Foster for her views on next steps. We already got the ambassadors, we already got Mr. Cooke's, and then after that, I'll just wrap up. And right, unless there are any more questions. So over to you, Mrs. Foster.
Okay, thanks very much, Alicia. So my last few comments in terms of that next steps and sort of maybe focusing specifically on the role that I think trade can play in particular. So just picking up on some of what Ambassador Wilson and Pierre and Dr. St. John would have spoken to. For me, I think front of pack warning labels are critical. We know there's a regional process going on. That is something that is a trade measure within the context of the TBT agreement. I would really like for us to continue to have that strong support in terms of the evidence-based response, which links into Ambassador Wilson's comment about the need to, because I think it's important for us to recognize that the trade argument isn't about we're going to stop all of these things from coming in. It is about providing people with real choices, to giving them the information that is free of conflict of interest that allows them to make an informed choice. If you feel like picking up the pack of M&Ms, you'll still pick up the pack of M&Ms, right? But you're going to pick it up understanding what it is you're consuming properly, and therefore, maybe not pick it up every day, and make more informed choices from that point of view. So that's one, front of pack warning labels. Equally, and that's something mentioned specifically in the declaration. Ambassador would have spoken as well to issues, Pierre, to issues of food quality and food safety promotion. And this is something that the declaration speaks to as well in terms of, so we need to have, I would like to see movement in terms of leveraging the health space, the trade space as it relates to the provisions that deal with agriculture, but also to food and food quality and safety, their standards, provisions, their, other things related there. I know that within the region, we are trying to move in terms of food security, which is linked once again to our changed diets and stuff like that. So seeing us use the space that's available within the agreement on agriculture to allow us to realize those food security and food sovereignty goals. And then also to access to medicine. So Pierre's point spoke specifically to mental health, but we know broadly, we saw even in the context, taking it slightly out of the NCD space, but all health at the end of the day, we saw in COVID, how, access to medicine matters. It matters. And so we really want to see the SIDS being able to leverage those discussions that are taking place within the WTO, but also WHO in terms of access to medicines more broadly in this space. And as we do all of these things, I think, and I note, and I'm not surprised that Ambassador Wilson said that it was very difficult to keep the conflict of interest bit in. It is a challenge. We get big pushback by those with vested interest, but it's so critical. And so I would really want that in all of these things, as we try to approach trade in this holistic, comprehensive, all of society way, that we do it still always remembering that we have to safeguard the public health space from conflict of interest that would ultimately undermine the goals that we have in mind. Not that we don't speak to everybody, we speak to everybody, but then when it comes to the point of making the policy, of taking the specific step, then we reserve that for governments. And my last point is just to strongly endorse what Ambassador Wilson said in terms of the needs. I think that is a critical next step. Identification of health and development champions, political champions. Political will really is the answer to our problem, finances as well. But we saw how with HIV, AIDS and these things, right? Certain things happen because where was HIV AIDS? It was in Prime Minister's offices, the global architecture was set up that you could only get funding and stuff if you had certain things in place in terms of certain plans, etc. So we need some political champions, some high-level health and development champions who have this whole of society perspective, but at the end of the day, remain committed to that ultimate goal of safeguarding health and promoting health in a meaningful way. That's it.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Foster. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you will agree, this has been a really rich session. Dr. St. John, as you know, had to leave us, but before I do my wrap up, I really want to say, panelists, thank you so much. You've given us so much food for thought, no pun intended. I mean, I have learned some new terms. Death by appetite is one that I definitely will be using for sure. So just to recap some of the key things, because we did have several objectives for this panel, and we talked about the need for the declaration. Ambassador Wilson, who was one of its architects, really drove home the point that it was a declaration by SIDS for SIDS, taking into account the lived realities of SIDS and the capacity constraints of SIDS. We talked about how trade is addressed in all of this. We talked about the fact, and Ambassador said it quite nicely, do not hide behind the trade rules. And Mrs. Foster as well said that trade is not necessarily a barrier to our goals. And really and truly, we could use trade as a carrot, not so much as a stick. In other words, using trade to encourage access to these healthier alternatives, as Mr. Cooke said, encouraging getting better access to medicines, especially medicines that might be harder to get in the region. We talked about the need to operationalize the document. So when we're talking about next steps, we want just words on a paper to something that's meaningfully helping to achieve the public health goals, because as we know, NCDs are a big burden in the region. So our next steps, as Ambassador Wilson said, and everyone said, is the need to operationalize and mainstream the document. We talked about the need for development assistance, the need to get the private sector on board, continue civil society engagement, the need for a whole of society approach. And we also talked, Mrs. Foster very eloquently talked about the need for political champions. And, that ties in very nicely with Mr. Cooke, because he is one of those rising champions. He is one of those youth who've been out there advocating and ensuring that the next generation can take this mantle forward. So on behalf of the SRC, and if I may, the LHRU, I just want to say thank you, a big heartfelt thanks to our esteemed panelists. Thank you to the SRC staff and the LHRU staff for all of your assistance in making this possible. To Campus IT, as always, thank you for facilitating, and you, of course, the audience, for spending your lunch time with us. Hopefully it was a healthy lunch. No one's judging. So thank you, everyone, and wish you a great, enjoyable day until the next SRC lunchtime chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a
Looking
good
forward
one.
to continuing the conversation.
Most definitely. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.